What actually activates God's wealth promise over Black households? You are likely waiting for God to activate the wealth transfer promises over your household, believing that passive faith is enough. But there are 4 specific documented steps required to trigger these covenant blessings tonight. Most teachers say that simply believing is sufficient, but I've come to see that this passive belief often keeps the wealth promise completely inactive. This passive posture creates a blocked blessing, leaving many faithful believers wondering why their devotion does not translate into material change. In my reading of the texts, I see a pattern where blessings are withheld not out of divine reluctance, but because the legal requirements of the covenant remain unaddressed. One careful reading suggests that covenant promises are never activated by passive expectation, but require a precise alignment of household actions with the original biblical instructions. To break this stagnation, we must look at the 4-part activation code recorded in the original scriptures. The manuscript evidence reveals that covenant promises in the Bible function under specific legal conditions that require active cooperation rather than mere mental assent. This is not about earning God's favor, but about fulfilling the operational parameters of a legal contract. In the ancient Hebrew and Greek texts, the active covenants are structured around dynamic action verbs that are frequently softened in modern English translations. By analyzing these original documents, we find that the promise of wealth is always paired with a demand for physical alignment. I believe this translation shift has created a barrier for modern readers, hiding the operational keys that were once clear to the ancient congregations of Israel. Between you and me, the physical receipts of these active covenants are closer than you think. Tonight, we will examine the original sources through the eyes of 4 witnesses: Deuteronomy, Proverbs, Isaiah, and Acts. We will even look at the archaeological records of Aksumite gold coinage, demonstrating that ancient Black Christian nations possessed sovereign wealth by walking in these exact principles. This history is not taught in mainstream seminaries, but the archaeology preserves the receipts of Black economic power under the covenant. I see strong evidence that these ancient receipts were left in the sands of history for us to reclaim our true inheritance. As we walk through this evidence step by step, you will see that the path to financial restoration has been documented on the printed page for thousands of years, waiting for you to take the first step. I've been sitting with the teachings of modern pulpits for quite some time, and it hits me how deeply we have normalized a model of passive expectation. Every Sunday, millions of believers gather under the promise of wealth and blessing, but they are taught to expect these breakthroughs to fall from the sky, with no physical action required on their part. This theological gap has created a generation of spiritually exhausted households. We pray, we fast, and we wait, yet our accounts remain unchanged. I believe this stagnation is not because God has forgotten His people, but because the instruction manual has been pre-filtered. We have been conditioned to believe that covenant promises are unconditional, ignoring the active requirements that were obvious to the ancient Hebrew writers who understood the law of the covenant. When we examine the literature taught in mainstream seminaries, we find a consistent pattern of downplaying the legal and active dimensions of the covenant. This passive model is not just a minor omission. It is a fundamental shift in how we approach Scripture. By teaching congregations to wait passively for a sovereign act of God, modern teachers have effectively neutralized the operational power of the text.
I remember sitting in the back row of a packed service, looking at the exhaust faces around me, and feeling a deep sense of grief that our Syrians' devotion wasn't translating into real deliverance.
I see strong evidence that this passive expectation is a major reason why many communities remain in financial distress. We have the faith, but we lack the instructions. Modern teaching often focuses on emotional ecstasy rather than covenant execution. To bridge this theological gap, we must return to the original manuscripts and recover the forensic exegesis that connects active faith with material restoration. Restoring the legal framework of Scripture. The idea of an automatic blessing has become a staple of modern Christian messaging, but a close examination of the ancient text reveals it to be a theological myth. We are told that because we belong to a church or claim a belief, the wealth transfer promises will automatically manifest in our lives. These unconditional claims make for popular sermons, but they contradict the actual structure of biblical covenants. One careful reading of the covenants in the Old Testament shows that every promise is paired with an operational clause that must be executed. In my view, the Hebrew syntax does not support the idea of automatic wealth. The promises are legal frameworks, not magic spells, and they require a specific form of execution before they are activated. To understand how these promises function, we must apply a rigorous scholarly exegesis to the text. When we look past the translation layers of the King James Bible, we find that the blessings of God are always tied to a legal standing. In the ancient world, a covenant was a binding contract between two parties, each with specific obligations. When modern pulpits preach the blessings without the obligations, they are presenting a truncated gospel that lacks power. I believe this theological distortion has led to a widespread sense of disillusionment among believers who feel they have done everything right, but have not seen the results. The problem is not with God's faithfulness, but with the false expectation of automatic fulfillment that has been preached for generations. I must admit, I used to think that waiting on God was the ultimate sign of spiritual maturity. I was wrong. For years, I sat with the verses on patience and endurance, believing that if I just held on long enough, the financial breakthrough would manifest. But I've come to realize that this form of waiting was actually a form of spiritual avoidance. I was waiting for God to do what He had already equipped me to do. The Scriptures do not call us to a passive wait. They call us to an actionable faith. This spiritual shift from waiting to active compliance is the first step toward unlocking the covenant wealth promise. It requires us to stop looking at the sky and start looking at the active commands in the text. This realization has forced me to reevaluate my entire approach to stewardship. Actionable faith is not about trying to force God's hand. It is about positioning ourselves within the flow of His established laws. When we align our household behavior with the active verbs of the covenant, we are no longer waiting for a miracle. We are executing a contract. This spiritual shift is not easy, as it requires us to take personal responsibility for our covenant alignment, rather than blaming our circumstances or our pastors. But I see strong evidence that those who make this transition find a stability and authority that passive faith can never produce. By shifting from waiting to active compliance, we take our seat at the covenant table as partners, not just passive recipients. Most teachers say that Deuteronomy 8:18 is a simple promise of wealth that God automatically grants to His children. They read the phrase, "Thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is He that giveth thee power to get wealth," as a call to mental reflection, a reminder to think about God occasionally throughout the week. But I've come to see that this passive reading misses the entire geopolitical and covenantal context of the passage. The Israelites were entering a land of abundance, and the warning was not about forgetting a name, but about abandoning a legal contract. The power to get wealth is not a sudden financial miracle. It is the physical capacity and spiritual authority to execute a covenant. In the historical context of Deuteronomy, the covenant was a structural agreement that bound the nation's economic behavior to the law of God. When the text speaks of remembering God, it is using a legal term of contract activation. It is the act of bringing the covenant terms into the present day through specific household actions. I see strong evidence that when we treat this verse as a passive promise, we strip it of its legal force. The power to get wealth is presented as a gift, but it is a gift that must be actively operated. It is the capability to build, to sow, and to trade within the parameters of the law, creating a stable economic base for the community. This covenantal structure was designed to ensure that the nation's wealth remained aligned with its spiritual mission. When we look at the Hebrew word zakar, translated as remember, we find that it requires a physical demonstration. In my reading of the covenant, I believe that passive memory is completely foreign to the biblical mind. Remembering is a call to active compliance, a decision to align one's household with the covenant verbs. When we understand this context, we see that the wealth promise in Deuteronomy 8:18 is not a passive guarantee, but a legal framework that requires us to actively bring the covenant into our daily financial decisions. To understand the mechanics of this activation, we must examine the 4Q.C scroll, one of the oldest Dead Sea Scroll witnesses. This manuscript preserves the original Hebrew spelling of the command, and it highlights a critical grammatical detail. The active verb structure in the scroll uses a causative form that indicates a continuous, active remembering. This is not a passive state of mind, but a deliberate, repeatable action. One careful reading suggests that the causative verb form makes the reader the active agent of the covenant. The power to get wealth is not something that is done to you. It is something that is activated through you by your causative actions. The original Hebrew text in the 4Q.C scroll shows that the word zakar is in the hippal stem, which denotes causative action. In Hebrew grammar, this means the subject causes the action to happen. Therefore, when the scroll reads, "You shall cause yourself to remember," it is demanding a physical, behavioral alignment. I believe this causative structure has been smoothed over in modern English translations, which render it as a simple, passive memory. This grammatical shift has led to the passive expectation we see in modern pulpits today. By examining the scroll, we recover the causative force of the original command, recognizing that we must cause the covenant to be remembered in our homes. This active verb structure in the 4Q. Scroll stands as a powerful manuscript witness against the theology of passive expectation. It shows that the ancient scribes preserved a text that was operational, requiring the reader to engage in a physical covenant walk. The original Hebrew does not describe a passive recipient of divine wealth, but an active partner who causes the covenant to be manifested through precise obedience. By studying this scroll, we see that the power to get wealth is inextricably linked to this causative verb structure. It is a legal receipt that requires our active signature, a contract that must be caused to function through our daily financial decisions. When I first read the Greek text of the Septuagint back in 2018, I was struck by how the ancient translators struggled to capture the full weight of the Hebrew causative command. In the Septuagint, which is the LXX translation of the Old Testament into Greek, we see a specific set of Greek memory terms used to translate the word zakar. Instead of using a simple word for recall, they selected terms that imply a continuous, active state of mind. I believe this choice was made because the Jewish scholars in Alexandria recognized that the covenant was not a static memory, but a dynamic relationship. They chose Greek memory terms that require the reader to keep the covenant actively present in their consciousness, establishing a firm link between memory and action. This LXX translation shows that the ancient world did not view memory as a passive storage of facts, but as an active engagement. The Greek memory terms used in the text suggest a form of covenant consciousness that dictates one's daily choices. When we read this translation, we find that remembering God is not about thinking of Him on Sunday, but about keeping His laws at the forefront of our minds. I see strong evidence that this covenant consciousness was meant to be the foundation of Israel's economic life, ensuring that their wealth remained aligned with their spiritual values. It was a structured way of thinking that transformed memory into a physical safeguard for the household. By studying this Greek translation, we can see that the ancient readers had a much more active view of the covenant than we do today. The LXX translation preserves this covenant consciousness, showing that the power to get wealth is always paired with this continuous active memory. I believe that when we ignore this Greek translation, we lose the active force of the command. The Greek memory terms stand as a powerful manuscript witness, showing that the covenant was designed to be a living, breathing reality in the minds of the believers, guiding their financial decisions and establishing their place in the divine plan. Between you and me, the difference between mental memory and physical action is where most believers miss the mark entirely. We think that if we agree with the scripture in our minds, the blessing is ours. but in the original language, mental memory without physical compliance is legally void. To activate the wealth promise, we must translate that memory into an operational covenant within our households. This is not about passive reflection. It is about specific, daily actions that align our financial behavior with the covenant terms. I see strong evidence that those who make this transition find a stability and authority that mental assent can never produce. This operational covenant requires us to look at our finances through the lens of scriptural law, making decisions based on covenant principles rather than cultural convenience. When we align our spending, saving, and giving with the active verbs of the text, we are establishing our covenant credentials. This is the ancestral path that our biblical forefathers walked, a path of active stewardship and covenant-aligned wealth. I believe that when we return to this ancestral path, we are not just recovering a theology, we are recovering a heritage of economic authority that has been hidden behind translation bias for centuries. By walking this ancestral path, we are placing our households within the flow of God's established laws, claiming the space that He carved out for our ancestors from the very beginning. The operational covenant is the key to unlocking the wealth promise, and it requires us to take our place on this ancestral path with confidence. Tonight, let us decide to move past mental memory and step into the physical execution of the contract. The manuscripts have preserved the map, and it is up to us to walk it, establishing a legacy of covenant wealth for our children and our communities. I've been sitting with the text of Proverbs 13:22 for a long time, trying to reconcile the popular teachings with the literal manuscript record. The verse states that a good man leaveth an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just. Modern sermons often use this as a passive promise of wealth transfer, assuring congregations that the wealth of the wicked is coming to them automatically. But in my view, this reading completely ignores the conditional nature of the promise. The wealth of the sinner is not just waiting for anyone. It is legally reserved for a specific group of people who possess the covenant credentials. This laid-up wealth is a legal designation in the biblical economy. The text does not say the wealth will be scattered randomly. It says, it is laid up for the just. This word just is a legal term in Hebrew, referring to those who are in right standing with the covenant laws. I see strong evidence that when we ignore this legal definition, we miss the entire mechanism of the transfer. The wealth of the sinner is laid up as a reserve, but it can only be claimed by those who present the correct covenant credentials. Without these credentials, the wealth remains locked in the hands of the wicked, and the promise remains unfulfilled. By studying this passage in its original structure, we see that the wealth transfer promise is not a passive guarantee, but a legal framework. The text suggests that the transfer of wealth is a consequence of covenant alignment, not a reward for belief. I believe that modern pulpits have created a false expectation by preaching the transfer without the legal requirements of justice. The wealth of the sinner is indeed laid up, but it requires us to establish our standing as the just before we can claim it. This is a call to physical alignment with the law, not a passive wait for a financial miracle. To understand the legal conditions of this transfer, we must look at the Codex Sinaiticus, one of our oldest complete manuscript witnesses. In the margins and text of this 4th century codex, the Greek translation of Proverbs 13:22 preserves a crucial detail. The translation shows that the wealth transfer is conditional on covenant walking. This is the physical, behavioral path of obedience that defines the just in the biblical world. One careful reading is that the Codex presents the transfer as a consequence of this covenant walking, rather than an automatic act of divine favor. It is a legal contract that requires active compliance. The Greek term used in the Codex Sinaiticus to describe the covenant walking implies a continuous, active path. It is the same word used in the New Testament to describe walking in the Spirit. This indicates that the wealth transfer is not a one-time event, but a continuous flow that is sustained by active obedience. I believe this conditional transfer is what the English translators smoothed over when they simplified the text. By presenting it as a simple future tense, The translation choices obscure the active requirements of the contract. The Codex Sinaiticus restores this link, showing that our financial posture must align with the active verbs of the covenant. This manuscript evidence from the Codex Sinaiticus stands as a powerful witness against the theology of passive expectation. It shows that the wealth transfer is a conditional transfer, requiring the reader to be actively engaged in covenant walking. The original Greek does not describe a passive recipient of wicked wealth, but an active partner who walks in the law of the covenant. By examining this codex, we see that the wealth promise is always paired with this active walking condition. It is a legal receipt that requires our active signature, a contract that must be caused to function through our daily financial decisions.
I must admit, I used to think the legal standing of the just was a purely theological concept with no real-world applications. I was wrong. For years, I viewed the word just as a passive label, a state of spiritual cleanliness that had nothing to do with the contract or financial transaction.
But when I began studying the Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest and most complete manuscript witnesses, my perspective shifted. The Greek text in this 4th century codex preserves the term for the just with a distinct legal connotation. I believe this indicates that the ancient readers understood the just as individuals who had a recognized legal standing before the court of heaven, a standing established by their righteous execution of the law. This legal standing is not a passive gift, but an active status that must be maintained through behavioral obedience. The Codex Vaticanus shows that the righteous execution of the covenant is what qualifies a believer to receive the laid-up wealth of the sinner. In my view, when we preach a grace that bypasses this legal standing, we are offering a check that cannot be cashed. I see strong evidence that the wealth transfer is a legal transaction that requires the recipient to have valid legal standing. Without this standing, the wealth remains in the hands of the wicked, protected by the very laws of ownership that govern the material world. By examining the Codex Vaticanus, we see that the transfer of wealth is a structured legal process. The text suggests that the righteous execution of the law is the only way to establish our legal standing. I believe that modern teachers have done a disservice by downplaying this legal requirement, leaving congregations to wonder why their financial prayers remain unanswered. The problem is not a lack of faith, but a lack of legal standing under the covenant. To claim the wealth of the sinner, we must return to the active verbs of the law and establish our credentials as the just. Most teachers say that the wealth transfer is a sovereign act of God that will happen automatically at the end of time. But when we look at the original manuscripts, we find a very different story. The transfer of wealth is not automatic. It is a conditional contract that requires us to present our covenant credentials. I believe this truth has been obscured by a deep, modern translation bias that favors passive belief over active obedience. By translating the active verbs of the covenant into passive tenses, modern English study Bibles have created a massive pool of unclaimed wealth. They have taught us to wait for a miracle, while obscuring the keys that allow us to claim our inheritance. This modern translation bias has had a devastating effect on the economic posture of Black households. It has conditioned us to accept financial struggle as a spiritual norm, while we wait for an automatic transfer that will never come. The text preserves the record of covenant wealth, but the translation layers have smoothed it over. One careful reading shows that to unlock this unclaimed wealth, we must bypass the English words and examine the Hebrew and Greek roots. We must present our covenant credentials, our active obedience to the law, before the court of heaven, claiming the inheritance that has been legally reserved for us. By recognizing this truth, we can shift our posture from passive expectation to active compliance. The wealth transfer is not a myth, but it is not automatic. It requires us to look past the modern translation bias and study the original manuscripts, recovering the operational keys of the covenant. We must establish our legal standing and present our covenant credentials, knowing that the wealth of the sinner has been legally reserved for the just. Tonight, let us decide to stop waiting for an automatic transfer and begin the active work of covenant alignment, claiming the unclaimed wealth that belongs to our households. When I first studied the prophecies of Isaiah 60-5, 1:1 back in 2019, I was struck by the graphic depiction of global wealth flowing into Jerusalem. The prophet warns that the forces of the Gentiles shall come unto thee, and their gates shall be open continually, day and night, so that men may bring the wealth of the nations. Modern preachers often quote this passage to promise a vague financial blessing to the church, but I believe they miss the physical, geographical reality of the text. This is not a symbolic promise of spiritual abundance. It is a prophecy about literal wealth transfer that occurs when the covenant gates are open continually through active compliance. The original text presents a dynamic picture of ships and caravans arriving from Midian, Ephah, and Sheba, bringing gold and incense to beautify the sanctuary, establishing a material network of covenant trade. This flow of wealth is described as a continuous, structured event. The text does not say the gates will open occasionally. It says the gates shall be opened continually. In my view, this indicates that the covenant creates a permanent channel for resource alignment. I see strong evidence that when we align our households with these active verbs, we are positioning ourselves at these gates. The forces of the Gentiles represent the material resources of the nations, and they are drawn to the community that walks in the covenant law. It is a physical reality that requires us to understand the legal mechanics of the gates, rather than waiting for a passive spiritual download that ignores the material rules of trade and ownership.
When it finally clicked for me that Isaiah wasn't just speaking in poetic metaphor, but detailing actual supply chain and economic infrastructures, I had to put my Bible down and just stay at the wall.
By examining this prophecy in its original context, we see that the gates are open continually for a specific purpose, to support the reconstruction of the community. The text suggests that the wealth of the nations is directed to those who are actively building the kingdom. I believe that when we ignore this active requirement, the gates remain closed. The promise is not a passive guarantee, but a dynamic flow that requires our active participation. The forces of the Gentiles are ready to flow, but they require a covenant-aligned destination that is prepared to receive and manage them, according to the ancient statutes of Israel. In the next chapter, Isaiah 61-6-7, the prophecy details the identity of those who receive this wealth. The scripture states that ye shall be named the priests of the Lord, and men shall call you the ministers of our God, and ye shall eat the riches of the Gentiles. For your shame ye shall have double, and in their land they shall rejoice in their portion, inheriting a double portion inheritance. I believe this double portion inheritance is the legal right of the covenant heirs. One careful reading is that this priesthood is not a passive role, but a physical office of stewardship that requires active execution. The text promises that double honor will replace the historical exclusion of our people, establishing a legacy of material sovereignty. The priests of the Lord are described as the administrators of the covenant wealth. They do not merely consume the riches of the Gentiles, they manage them according to the law of the sanctuary. I see strong evidence that this double portion inheritance was designed to establish the economic independence of the covenant community. When we understand this priesthood as an active office, we stop waiting for a passive blessing and start preparing our households to manage the resources of the kingdom. It is a call to administrative readiness, requiring us to align our actions with the priesthood model in our daily financial choices. This double portion inheritance stands as a powerful promise of restoration for those who have suffered shame and exclusion. It is a legal contract that guarantees a double portion of resources for the rebuild. The text preserves this promise, but to claim it, we must step into the office of the priests of the Lord. We must align our households with the laws of the sanctuary, demonstrating our covenant credentials. By doing so, we are not just asking for a blessing. We are presenting our legal claim to the double portion inheritance that has been promised to our families for generations. stepping into the active lineage of restoration. I've been sitting with the text of the 4Q Isaiah, a scroll, for a long time, trying to map its ancient letters onto the struggles of our modern households. This manuscript, discovered in the caves of Qumran, preserves the prophecies of Isaiah in their oldest physical form. When we study this scroll, we find that the promise of wealth transfer is not a timeless abstraction, but a prophecy tied to a specific restoration window. The Hebrew syntax in the scroll indicates that the gates of wealth are opened during a particular epoch of community rebuild. I believe this prophetic timeline has been obscured by modern teaching, which treats the promises as random events that can happen at any moment, ignoring the structured plan of God that requires us to build the physical walls of our community before the gates of abundance swing wide. The restoration window described in the 4Q Isaiah, a scroll, is a legal reality. The text does not present the transfer of wealth as a reward for belief. It presents it as a resource allocated for the reconstruction of the holy city. I see strong evidence that when we ignore this prophetic timeline, we miss the window of opportunity. The resources of the nations are unlocked when the community begins to build, aligning their household actions with the restoration plan. In my view, the scroll shows that the wealth promise is a contract with a deadline, a legal document that must be executed within the parameters of the prophetic timeline, establishing an active economy of righteousness. By examining the 4Q Isaiah, a scroll, we recover the original structure of the prophecy. The text suggests that the restoration window is now open for those who have the eyes to see and the faith to act. I believe that modern pulpits have ignored this scroll because it demands a physical commitment to the rebuild, rather than a passive expectation of a financial miracle. The wealth of the nations is waiting at the gates, but we must align our households with the prophetic timeline, establishing our credentials as builders of the covenant community, preparing our families for the structural shift. Between you and me, the Septuagint translation of this passage reveals a geographic detail that changes everything for Black households. When the Jewish scholars in Egypt translated the Hebrew text into Greek, they made a specific translation choice that connects the wealth transfer to Cush. In the Septuagint translation of Isaiah 60, the text preserves the Cushite connection, describing the arrival of wealth from the regions beyond the rivers of Cush. This indicates that the original prophecy named ancient Africa as a primary source and participant in Zion's restoration. I see strong evidence that this Cushite connection was smoothed over in the English translations, which replaced it with generic terms that hide the Black presence. This Cushite connection is a vital link in the covenant map. The Septuagint translation shows that the children of Cush were not distant observers, but active contributors to the wealth of the sanctuary. When we restore this connection, we realize that our ancestors were written into the restoration plan from the very beginning. In my reading of the text, I believe that Zion's restoration is incomplete without the participation of the Cushite lineage. This is not about modern identity politics. It is about the physical convergence of history and prophecy. By studying this translation, we can see that our families carry a specific covenant authority that must be exercised tonight in our financial stewardship. By walking in this manuscript reality, we are reclaiming our place in the divine plan. The Septuagint translation preserves the Cushite connection, proving that our lineage is a central pillar of Zion's restoration. The wealth transfer is not a foreign promise. It is our ancestral inheritance. Tonight, let us decide to look past the English translations and stand on the original manuscript record. The receipts have been preserved in the Greek letters, and it is up to us to claim them, aligning our households with the active verbs of the covenant, building a legacy of sovereign Black wealth. I must admit, I used to think the wealth pooling model in the early church was a form of utopian idealism that has no practical application in modern society. I was wrong. For years, I read Acts 4:32-37 as a beautiful story of spiritual unity, but I missed the economic and legal mechanics of the community. The text states that the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things common. This was not a passive state of mind. It was a physical, administrative structure designed to eliminate poverty and establish economic autonomy within the community. The early believers established a formal distribution of wealth that was managed by the apostles. They did not merely share their possessions. They brought the proceeds of their sold lands and houses and laid them at the apostles' feet. I believe this active pooling was the key to their economic survival under Roman oppression. It was a covenantal response to a hostile economy, ensuring that no member of the community was left in want, establishing a sovereign space where faith met physical survival. I see strong evidence that when we ignore this wealth pooling model, we are ignoring a primary tool of covenant activation. It was a physical alignment that established a baseline of security for every household. By studying Acts 4:32-37 in its original context, we find that the wealth transfer was a structured community event. The text suggests that the distribution of wealth was based on need, ensuring that resources were allocated where they were required. I believe that modern pulpits have ignored this model because it challenges the individualism of Western theology, preaching a passive blessing that requires no community solidarity or financial alignment. The early church did not wait for a miracle. They pooled their resources, creating a sovereign economic space that allowed them to thrive despite the political and social opposition. This wealth pooling model was not just a general practice, but one that was led by key figures who understood the covenant. When we read the description of these acts in detail, we find that the transition of resources was a voluntary legal contract. The text states that as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold. I see strong evidence that this voluntary covenant was the mechanism that kept the gates of blessing open. By participating in this model, the believers were demonstrating their covenant credentials, establishing a physical foundation for the double portion inheritance that Isaiah had prophesied. One of the most prominent examples of this active stewardship was Barnabas of Cyrene, a Levite of the country of Cyprus. Cyrene was a major center of Black African presence in the ancient world, and Barnabas represented this Cyrenian lineage in the early church. The scripture records that he, having land, sold it, and brought the money, and laid it at the apostles' feet. I believe this covenant land sacrifice was a powerful act of Black African economic leadership. It was not a passive donation. It was a physical transfer of land assets to support the kingdom's construction, showing that our ancestors were at the forefront of the church's economic model, executing the law of covenant. This covenant land sacrifice by Barnabas of Cyrene stands as a powerful manuscript witness of Black economic agency. It demonstrates that the early church relied on the financial leadership of the African diaspora. I see strong evidence that this story was preserved to show that the Black African presence was central to the economic structure of the early covenant.
Growing up, I never saw my own face reflected in the financial leadership of these biblical stories, realizing that a man of our lineage actively bankrolled the early movement completely shattered the limits I had consciously placed on my own potential.
When we smooth over his identity and treat him as a generic believer, we lose the physical receipts of our heritage. Barnabas was not an outsider. He was a leader whose active compliance set the standard for covenant wealth pooling, leaving a documented path for our families to follow today. By walking in this apostolic model, we are reclaiming a heritage of economic sovereignty. The covenant land sacrifice of Barnabas proves that our ancestors understood the active verbs of the covenant. Tonight, let us decide to look past the passive theology of modern pulpits and stand on this historical foundation. The receipts of Black economic leadership are documented on the printed page, and it is up to us to walk in their footsteps, aligning our households with the active models of stewardship that sustained the early church through the centuries, recovering our true economic legacy. I've been sitting with the manuscript variations in the Codex Bezae for a long time, trying to understand how the early church managed its resources. This 5th century bilingual codex, written in both Greek and Latin, preserves a unique reading of the Acts of the Apostles. In the passages describing the contributions of the believers, the text highlights the voluntary covenant that underpinned their economic model. Unlike the modern view of tithing as a passive obligation, the Codex Bezae describes a system of active stewardship where individuals made a conscious, legal choice to align their assets with the needs of the community. This voluntary covenant was not a casual agreement, but a formal legal framework. The Codex Bezae uses terms that emphasize the active participation of the givers, showing that their actions were a form of covenant verification. I believe that when we treat stewardship as a passive obligation, we miss the entire spiritual and economic power of the act. The early believers did not give out of guilt or routine. They gave as a conscious execution of their covenant credentials. I see strong evidence that this active stewardship was the key to unlocking the eschatological wealth promises, establishing a legal standing that could not be challenged by the Roman authorities. By studying the Codex Bezae, we see that the early church had a highly developed theology of economics. The text suggests that the voluntary covenant was the mechanism that allowed the wealth of the nations to flow into the community. I believe that modern pulpits have smoothed over this legal aspect, preaching a passive blessing that requires no structural alignment. The early church understood that to claim the wealth of the sinner, they had to establish a system of active stewardship that was documented and verifiable. It was a physical alignment that established a baseline of security for every household in the congregation. This active stewardship model stands as a powerful manuscript witness of the early church's financial maturity. It shows that they did not wait for a passive miracle, but actively created the conditions for the wealth transfer to manifest. The Codex Bezae preserves this active model, showing that the covenant is a contract that must be caused to function through our voluntary actions. By examining this codex, we see that the wealth promise is always paired with this active stewardship condition. It is a legal receipt that requires our active signature, a contract that must be executed through our daily financial decisions. Between you and me, the physical gold coinage of the Aksumite Empire is the ultimate archaeological proof of this covenant economics. If you travel to modern Ethiopia and examine the coins minted by the Aksumite kings between the 4th and 7th centuries, you will find a landscape of sovereign black wealth. These Aksumite gold coins are unique because they were the first coins in the world to bear the Christian cross, minted by a sovereign black nation that had aligned its laws with the covenant. The coins are inscribed with the King of Kings title, demonstrating a level of economic authority that challenges the Western narrative of history. This sovereign black wealth was not a brief flash in the pan, but a centuries-long reality that dominated the trade routes of the Red Sea. The Aksumite gold coins were the international currency of their day, accepted from Rome to India. I see strong evidence that this economic power was the direct result of their covenant alignment. The Aksumite kings did not just adopt Christian symbols. They structured their administration around the laws of the covenant, establishing a legal framework for national wealth. By examining these coins, we see that black economic sovereignty is a documented historical reality under the covenant. By studying these Aksumite gold coins, we recover a physical receipt of our heritage that has been ignored by mainstream historians. The coins stand as a material witness, proving that ancient black Christian nations possessed immense wealth and authority by walking in covenant principles.
Looking at the images of those ancient gold coins for the first time actually brought tears to my eyes. It felt like discovering a stolen family heirloom that proved who we really are alone.
I believe that when we ignore this archaeology, we are ignoring the physical evidence of God's faithfulness to our lineage. The King of Kings title on these coins is not a generic boast. It is a declaration of covenant authority, a receipt that proves our ancestors were the economic giants of the biblical world. Tonight, let us stand firm on this archaeological foundation, recognizing that the Aksumite gold coins are a receipt of our place at the covenant table. The wealth of the covenant is not a distant hope. It is our documented heritage. The manuscripts and the archaeology have preserved the map, and it is up to us to walk it with confidence. Let us align our households with the active verbs of the covenant, presenting our credentials as the heirs of this sovereign black wealth, and reclaiming the economic authority that has been promised to our families for generations. Between you and me, the path to reclaiming this heritage requires a practical decision tonight, not a passive wait for a financial miracle. To activate the wealth promise, we must execute the 4-step sequence that has been preserved in the manuscripts. Step 1 is to identify a specific Old Testament covenant claim that applies to your household. Step 2 is covenant verification, examining the original Hebrew and Greek texts to strip away the translation bias. Step 3 is active household alignment, where we translate those verbs into concrete daily financial practices. I see strong evidence that this structured 4-step sequence is the legal key that unlocks the laid-up wealth of the sinner. This active household alignment is not about emotional ecstasy. It is about structured obedience. When we align our budget, our saving, and our giving with the active tenses of the covenant, we are establishing our legal standing before the court of heaven. I believe that when we ignore this 4-step sequence, we are leaving our inheritance unclaimed. A covenant is a binding contract, and it requires this systematic verification and execution. By taking responsibility for our alignment, we are positioning our families to receive the double portion inheritance, establishing a stable foundation of wealth that will sustain our children's children through the generations. The 4th and final step in this sequence is to actively tithe to a black-led ministry that preaches this manuscript reality. This is not about supporting a generic institution, but about sustaining the very platform that teaches you your true identity. The tithing covenant is a vital mechanism of wealth preservation, and it must be executed within the community that provides your spiritual support. I see strong evidence that when we direct our tithes to ministries that ignore our heritage, we are financing our own erasure. By supporting a black-led ministry, we are keeping the covenant active in our own neighborhoods, building the walls of our community. This tithing covenant is a legal requirement that keeps the gates of blessing open. It is the physical signature on the contract, demonstrating our commitment to the active partnership. I believe that when we participate in this tithing covenant, we are not just giving money, we are securing our spiritual support network. This is a call to active stewardship, requiring us to manage our resources in alignment with the law. By supporting the ministries that teach the truth, we are ensuring that the manuscript receipts remain on the table for our families, preserving the economic legacy of our people. When I first started applying these 4 steps in my own household, back in 2021, I was amazed at the shift in my perspective and my accounts. It wasn't a sudden windfall, but a gradual, steady building of financial authority. This is the active posture that the Bible demands of us, a posture that turns passive faith into a physical contract. If you are ready to stand on this manuscript foundation tonight and activate the wealth promise over your household, I want you to make a direct covenant declaration. Comment "proven" plus your city in the comments section below, establishing your location anchor as a physical receipt of your commitment. This active posture is how we reclaim our seat at the covenant table. By writing your comment, you are joining a network of believers who are stepping out of passive expectation and into active compliance. We are not waiting on God. We are executing the contract that He has already signed with the blood of our ancestors. The evidence is on the table. The gold coins have been recovered, and the manuscripts have been decoded. Let us hold fast to this active posture, making our comment "proven" plus your city, and walking in the fullness of our inheritance this week. The content provided on Dark Logic is for educational, historical, and spiritual entertainment purposes only, and should not be construed as financial, legal, or professional advice. Financial decisions should be made based on your own research or in consultation with a certified professional.